Hello, this is John Torrens from the Whitman School of Management at Syracuse University, and today we're going to be talking about the operations and logistics section of your business plan. So welcome to session 6 of our business plan lab. So an overview of operations and logistics. It actually encompasses more than just operations and logistics. This is just the general term we use. So we're going to talk about why it's important, again, how to handle it in the written plan, and then using nuts and bolts as a guide for your sections 6, 7, 9, and 10. So I like to use working examples. So you're already familiar with Grounded from last week, and this was the company that takes recycled coffee grounds from coffee shops. They had a good relationship with Tim Hortons, for example, and they're going to turn that into an organic, sustainable, safe dog shampoo. So you had an example of that last week in the marketing section, and I'm going to introduce a new company called Bioremediation Solutions, or BRS. And BRS is an interesting company. So what they proposed to do was take a fungus, a mushroom that was discovered or cultivated at Yale University in one of the research labs. And the interesting thing about this mushroom or fungus was that it survives on a diet of polyurethane or plastic. So what they decided to do was see if they could take this mushroom and somehow make a solvent or solution out of it and spray it on landfills in a way to deteriorate or digest the polyurethane, which would be good for the planet, good for the landfill owners and things like that. So by decreasing the amount of plastic in landfills, landfill owners had more room to take other trash that wouldn't last as long. So we're going to use BRS and Grounded both as examples because they have good. There's good things about both of them, and they're pretty different companies. Grounded is not quite as high tech as BRS, so that's why we're using those. So first, before the examples, I'll give you a general overview of each section, and I'll tell you how to handle it and why it's important and things like that. In general, in design and development, the reason this is important is because it shows the judges that you've thought this through, right? They understand what's coming down the line, and often in design and development, this is what the funding is used for. So if it's an investor or a judge, they're kind of thinking along these lines in terms of what you're going to use the money for. R&D is a big part of what you use the proceeds from any capital raise for. So this is really where you justify what you're going to use the money for the most part. Okay, so and again, you're going to be limited to 2 or 3 pages. So it's not a long section. So you have to jam a lot of good content into a small amount of real estate in the plan. So in section 6, you're just going to give development status and tasks, difficulties and risks, although I usually advise my students not to put too much into that because there's another section on critical risks and assumptions that you can get into that in more detail. And if you find that you're running out of room, difficulties and risks is a perfect place to steal from. Take content away from here and put it in a later section that deals specifically with it. Then you'll talk about product improvement and new products because investors want to know that you're not the one-trick pony and that you've got a pipeline of new development that's going to keep the company sustainable and growing. Maybe some development costs, right? So if you've got some R&D, maybe you've got to design an application or a website, or if you've got a technology, you'll just detail some of those. And then you'll talk about some proprietary issues, and I'll give you a few examples of that. So again, this is used to get the investor excited. Because this is how they're going to use their money, how you're going to use their money. All right, so examples of milestones. This is taken from Grounded, and you'll notice that there's no dates on this one just yet. This is just simply showing you what they have to do, right? This is kind of the plan, okay? So we got to source our raw materials and natural soap base and develop written contracts and all the way down to ship the final product to retailers, okay? Later on, there's another section where you're going to actually attach dates to this. This is where you just kind of show the general flow. Okay, you don't have to get a lot of detail in it. You just have to show the milestones. So, think in terms of what are the key things you have to do in the development plan, and then maybe a few things after that. This is another example from Grounded of the development and improvement planning. You just see in year 1, 2, and 3, the types of things they're proposing to do in terms of new products, maybe new location expansion, new partnerships, and they've included a column for R&D, which shows that they're going to constantly be innovating and not just resting on their laurels, but moving forward as well. So this is an example. And again, you can use these templates, but of course you can't just copy and paste the content because you're not proposing to make a dog shampoo or a mushroom, right? So tailor any of this stuff as it suits you, or if you have a different template that you prefer, go ahead and use that. I'm just giving these to you because personally I like to work with examples, and so I figured this would be helpful for you. All right, on the next slide, there's two different proprietary issues, right? One is the trade secret strategy, and one's a patent strategy. So on the left is Grounded, and they're going with the trade secret strategy because they feel that actually is more valuable for them. So my favorite example of a trade secret is Coca-Cola, right? There's no patent on the formula for Coke. If there was a patent on it, you could actually go to the patent and trademark website and see exactly how they make it. And that would decrease the value of Coca-Cola. Coke is more valuable because nobody knows how they make it. All right, and so Grounded is kind of taking that same tack, right? So they're saying, look, if we expose the recipe, then people can knock it off or imitate it. So we're going to keep it as a trade secret. And there are serious legal protections around trade secrets. It's a very valuable strategy. So this is an example of how you could word that. On the other hand, if you're going with a patent strategy, so in BRS's case, what they're doing is taking this microspora fungus and using an enzyme to turn it into a solvent, and they're going to talk about the patent that they're going to have on the actual solvent, as well as a process patent in terms of how they do that. Okay, so they've got a couple of different intellectual property pieces. One is the utility patent for the solvent, and the other is a process patent on how they make, apply, and maintain it. They've proposed to do temporary patents or provisional patents, and a provisional patent basically gives you, I think it's a year's worth of protection while you develop it and things like that. So two different types of strategies and how you can deal with it. And now remember, not every business is going to have intellectual property, right? Very few companies actually do. So again, you could go with the trade secret strategy, or other ways to kind of accomplish what IP does, IP being intellectual property. Intellectual property is there to help you maintain a competitive advantage over time. So you can also do that by having processes and systems that are hard to imitate. Okay, it doesn't always have to be IP. I mean, IP is hard to imitate by its definition, but you could do other things like trade secrets, which are hard to imitate, or actually illegal to imitate, or steal, or something like that. But you could do it. You could have just really slick processes. You could have a value chain relationship with all the parts of your value chain that's really sophisticated. There's a lot of other ways to do it. So if you don't have proprietary issues, just explain how you're going to maintain a competitive advantage, because judges generally don't like to look at this section and see it blank, right? So if you don't have patents or things like that, just explain how you will maintain a competitive advantage over time. All right, so on to the next section, your operations plan. So speaking of competitive advantage, operations is one of those ways that you maintain a long-term sustainable competitive advantage. And I know I've used Southwest as an example in the past, but Southwest is an airline. They fly people from point A to point B, and they are profitable year over year. Whereas companies like United, American, and Delta, they are profitable at times, but then they're unprofitable at times as well. They lose a lot of money from time to time. And it's all about operations. And even though Delta can look at Southwest and see exactly how they do it, they're not Southwest, and they can't become Southwest because they've got legacy processes, procedures, and systems in place that prevent them from doing that. So building an operations plan that's really slick and well thought out from the beginning is a source of competitive advantage. So think of that and write this section along those lines. Okay, so that's why this is important. Again, how to handle it. I'll give you a few good graphics that you can use that tells the entire operations story through your value chain, and that's a really good way to handle it. And again, you've got 2 to 3 pages, so you have to be pretty stingy with your wording. Okay, so these are the large buckets or large sections. And again, if you look at nuts and bolts, they have sub bullets under each one of these. But if you just think in these large categories, you should be okay. So talk about your general strategy in terms of front of the house, back of the house, and I'll give you a graphic in another slide or two that you can use. Location, right? I mean, that's a sentence or two, no big deal. But in terms of how that kind of reconciles with your overall strategy, that's important. Okay, so if logistics is a big deal for you, you want to make sure that you're maybe near a major hub for something, or near a highway, or near a distribution point for FedEx. Okay. Likewise, if you have to ship things back and forth to China, you might want to be in LA, or whatever it happens to be. Make sure it makes sense. Okay. Then you talk about your facilities and equipment requirements if you have them, capacity levels, inventory management. And that can be a sentence or two, but it should really reconcile and be backed up by your primary research, which shows that, hey, you know what the demand is going to be, for example, if it's seasonal, so on and so forth. And then legal issues affecting operations. Everybody's got legal issues, but you should be able to show that you understand it as it relates to your concept. So if you're in the food business, okay, you're going to have Department of Health and Serve Safe and all these types of things that you have to deal with, versus if you're in the financial industry, then you've got the SEC and all sorts of things, right? I mean, everybody's got basic corporate law, and they've got liability and things like that, product liability if you're a product. But what are the things specific to your industry or company? All right, so this is an example of a value chain, and I would recommend that you just grab this graphic off the slide, or replicate it and populate it based on your company. So, along the vertical axis, you'll see firm infrastructure, HR management, technology, procurement. Those are kind of the back of the house stuff, right? Those are things that every company does, and how you do this, kind of can translate into your competitive advantage if everything works together and it articulates and reconciles, right? And then along the horizontal axis, you've got logistics, in-store operations, marketing and sales, after-sales service. That's more front of the house. All right, so that's grounded. This is how they handled it. On the next slide, you can see BRS's value chain. And again, it's a similar graphic, right? I provided it to all my students, and they used it as they wanted. And again, you can see that the things in the back of the house kind of support the activities and the behaviors from the front of the house, right? And this one graphic this picture can take the place of a lot of text. So I would use this in your plan. Use it if you want to use it on a slide, you can do that too. But yeah, I would definitely grab this and use it to tell the story of your operations. All right, and then of course before you end this section, just kind of maybe a line or two or a short paragraph on a day in the life of running your company, what it looks like, and make sure to bake in time for doing things like paying bills and marketing and your recruiting and all that kind of stuff. All right, but again, you don't have a lot of space, which is why I suggest using a graphic like this to tell the story. Okay. All right, next slide. Overall schedule. This part is relatively simple too. You can get away with a sentence or two and a graphic chart. Okay. Some of the things you want to include are the incorporation, the R&D completion, all the way down to your first payment. That first payment is critical, right? So for an investor or a judge, the schedule is great. Okay, here's when you do X, Y, and Z, but what they're really interested in is when do you make that first deposit? Okay, when do you actually make that first sale, and then when does the cash actually come in? That's that's a high interest topic for investors and judges and things like that. So make sure you include something along those lines. All right, so on this slide, I've given you BRS's year one schedule. Okay, you'll see just in year one, they've got a lot of a lot of payment pounding to do, right? They've got some R&D, they've got to be selling, they got to file patents and all that kind of thing. The next slide, you can see years 2 and 3. Okay, in year 2 is when they break even. Okay, which is obviously a good thing to put in terms of milestones. And then year 3 and 4, they just kind of do some renegotiations and all that kind of thing, right? This is a decent schedule, but there's a lot of things in it that could potentially be quite a bit better. All right, grounded year one schedule. This is a little bit more detailed, right? It kind of goes through in a lot more detail in terms of development and then promotion, which is also important. So this, there's some strengths here relative to BRS, and this is maybe something that would be a little bit more exciting. Okay, so you can see things like they've got their R&D, in their first month of year one, all the way down to making new batches of product and banner ads and online search engine optimization and that sort of thing. So this is a pretty good example of a schedule. And on the next slide, you can see years 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. They've included year 6 because this is kind of their exit strategy, right? This is how they're going to make their investors whole and their liquidity event and that kind of stuff. It's not necessary that you do year 6, but in their case, they thought it was important. So pretty simple. The chart itself is not difficult to put together. It's all the work you have to do to put it together. People will look at your chart with a fine-tooth comb just to see if it's realistic, right? See if it makes sense. They will look through it and ask you questions on it because it's if you think about it from an investor or a judge's perspective, it's a pretty easy thing to pick apart and ask questions on, right? Because it's linear. Okay, so they can kind of ask you for your rationale, or does this make sense? So make sure you put some thought in it, and if you're missing certain milestones, they'll be sure to point those out for you, and ask how you're going to address those. Next slide: critical risks, problems, and assumptions. All right, so this is where I guess the basic idea for this one is that you're not insulting their intelligence, right? Because business plans are inherently optimistic, they're very positive, you show these hockey stick projections and how wonderful the company is, and there's really no part in the plan where you talk about the liabilities and the potential problems and things like that. So this is the place you do it. This is where you build your own credibility, and you kind of answer questions before they've been asked, right? So yeah, you know that there's certain problems, there's competition, you've got technical risk and regulatory risk, cash flow potential problems, and this is where you address it. All right, so you address it here before they ask the question, because you don't want to have somebody ask you the question because they think you haven't addressed it. So that's where you do it here. So you discuss some key assumptions that are implicit in your plan, right? So things like your revenue, your top line revenue projections, your pricing, any intellectual property, your growth rate, things like that. This is where you kind of lay it out there and discuss your assumptions. Okay. Because one of the worst things that could happen is, somebody asks you, well, why did you set your price at $5 for this product? And you say, well, I just thought that was a good price. Okay, you have to back it up with your primary market research and that sort of thing. Okay? And then you identify and discuss any major problems and other risks like, the competition, cash flow, hey, maybe you're doing business with the government and you think you're going to get paid in 30 days, but there's the possibility it's going to be 90 or 120, which is going to seriously encumber your cash flow as a startup. Maybe there's, advancing technologies that you're going to have to keep on top of, and as a startup with limited resources, you may not be able to for the first couple years because you're going to be focused on your own technologies. Maybe there's regulation changes, right? Maybe there's some pending legislation or regulations coming down that could seriously impact you. And then you just talk about general assumptions, potential problems, things that are critical to the success of the venture, and then how you minimize their impact, right? So in the example of BRS, one of the critical things is, what if they can't get a patent on it, right? Maybe what if they're infringing on somebody's intellectual property because somebody has already patented it? Now, in their case, that's not true because they were working with the patent holders. But if you do a Google patent search or something and you find that somebody has the IP, one way you minimize that impact is you call the patent holder and see if they can license or commercialize with you, right? Or maybe what if it's critical that you have a product launch in the fall because that's when the big trade show is, when you're going to have to display it, and that's when you're hoping to take a lot of orders. What if one of their big risks is the R&D takes too long and you don't launch by the fall? Then what do you do, right? Do you wait till the next fall? Is there another big milestone or trade show in the spring that you can get to? What do you do if you miss a big milestone? For example. Okay, so those are some really important things to bring up, and again, it builds your credibility. it shows that you've thought this stuff through, and you say, yeah, there's problems with this business, just like with every business, but this is how we're going to mitigate the problems, right? And it just shows you thought it through. So here's an example of Grounded and their risks, right? So they've listed competitors. Hey, once you start making money, you're going to attract other sharks to the site of the kill, right? Everybody's going to want a piece of it. So competitors are a problem. In Grounded's case, they have a supply chain issue where, what if their cafe and coffee retailers just weren't interested in playing nice, right? Then they've got a problem because their raw material, the used coffee grounds, are a big problem, okay? And they've got other raw materials like Castile and things like that could fluctuate in price, and then supply demand. So they've listed those. The next slide is Grounded's assumptions. Okay, so they've talked about their price. Okay, and they kind of relate it back to their market research, which is really good. They talk about market share, which is a huge assumption in your financials, and we'll talk about that in the next session. They talk about distribution, right? Because again, you could have a great product or service, but if you can't get it on the shelves and into the customer's hands, then you really don't have anything. So, they talk about those assumptions. Coffee ground pickup, all these other types of things, right? So they address the assumptions, they go through their rationale, and they make it clear to the investor or the judge how they got there. Now, an investor could disagree with some of your basic assumptions, and that's fine. You're going to get that a lot because, smart people can disagree for perfectly reasonable reasons, right? But as long as you kind of go through your rationale and explain how you got to your assumption, at least they get it, right? Because it's a completely different thing to say, well, we priced our product at $13.99, and the judge says, well, I don't think that's really a great price. I think you should really be at $10, right? So they disagree with you on that. And then if you say, well, when we surveyed our target customers, they told us that 80% of them said they would spend up to $15 on it, and when we kind of tightened it and crunched it a little bit more, we realized that we would unlock the greatest market share at $13.99, and that is good for the retailers because this is how they want to mark it up and so on. That's a completely different conversation than saying, well, we thought $13.99 was good because other shampoos sell for $12. Right? So even though a judge or an investor might disagree with you, it's completely different if they understand your rationale. If they understand your rationale, you're in a much better place than if you just say, well, that's what we think. Okay? And that's true of, your risks and assumptions in general. All right? So again, these 4 sections, you've got 2 to 3 pages per section. So for everything we've talked about today, you're looking at maybe 12 pages. Okay? You don't want to go too much longer than that. These are important sections, but most of these sections are important, right? And you've got to, kind of be, you got to be conservative with the amount of real estate you provide for each section of it. So here's some examples, for these sections, and use whatever you want from them. And next week we're going to start talking about financials in section 11. So to prepare for that. It's going to be a really good idea if you've already maybe finished your market research, you've done some surveys, you've got some pricing sensitivity, because you're going to need to be able to project your top line sales based on some pricing assumptions, market share assumptions, and you're going to need to know your cost of goods sold and your fixed expenses, all the things we talked about a couple weeks ago. So next week we're only dealing with that one section, but it's a big section. So we'll kind of go through a little bit about how to start to build the financials. I'll provide you with a template, and we'll talk about the importance of footnoting as many lines in your financials as possible. So, thanks for attending this tutorial in session 5, and we'll catch back up next week when we talk about financials.